I think there's a sorry, Ibrahim. I just want to say I think it's very important, especially in Afghanistan, because, like I said, it's a microcosm of war on terror rhetoric and policy being enacted to devastating effect. But we need to bear in mind, and I'm the history student here, but for example, when the first semblance when Mirwais Khan Hotak revolted against the Safavis in the early 18th century, he did so by obtaining a fatwa from religious authorities in Mecca when he went to pilgrimage there. When we look at the founder of what we consider the founder of the modern Afghan state, Ahmad Shah Durrani, he was actually in very close contact in correspondence with the spiritual forefather of Deoband as a school in India. Deoband obviously being a Hanafi oriented school. So it was actually because of that correspondence that Ahmad Shah Durrani was encouraged to invade India, to conquer it, and to fight with certain empires. And more recently, if we look at the 80s, the parties of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Professor Burhanuddin Rabbani, Ustad Sayaf, these were Ikhwani parties. But the parties of people like Maulawi Muhammad Nabi Muhammadi, Maulawi Yunus Khalis, the others were not actually Ikhwani based. And it's actually funny because the bulk of these, the remnants of those movements, the non-Ikhwani movements, actually defected to the Taliban later on.
Yeah.
So we have to. There has to be a recognition that in Afghanistan the influence of Ikhwanism has been relatively quite limited.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As well as the fact that, sorry, my last point, as well as the fact that, many of the Taliban's most senior figures have been educated in Pakistan, not in Al-Azhar or in Medina, but actually in Pakistan and India, where they've received classical Hanafi education in the religious sciences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just wanted to make a few points about the Ikhwan thing. Actually, if you look at in the mid-90s, the main group that the Taliban originally fought when they came out of Kandahar was generally it was Hikmatyar's group, which was Hizb Islami.
Yes.
And actually, at that time, they were being supported by Burhanuddin Rabbani and Ahmad Shah Massoud. And then as soon as they got to Kabul, having defeated Hikmatyar, then Burhanuddin Rabbani and Ahmad Shah Massoud, they turned on them. They said, basically the Pakistani puppets, etc., etc. But they were actually supporting them well before that. And in 1995 to 96, in that period, the Pakistani Jamaat-e-Islami, which was very close to Hikmatyar, and it was sort of close to Rabbani as well.
Yeah.
They were generally neutral in the war between these two, but they were seen as being pro-Hikmatyar. They actually brokered a peace between Rabbani and Hikmatyar in the summer of 1996.
This is when Hikmatyar was made prime minister for about 2 months, right?
Yeah.
Just before the Taliban captured Kabul. So this was actually arranged by Qazi Hussain, who is the leader of Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan. And Hamid Gul, the Pakistani former spy master, who is often cited as being like, the brains behind the Taliban, or, like the ideological. He was extremely hostile to the Taliban at the start. He was, because he viewed them as being like a stalking horse for the former monarchy, because he was a very big supporter of Hikmatyar. He was somewhat supportive of Sayaf and Rabbani as well. But at that time, between 1994 and 1990...
Can we say that General Hamid Gul was Ikhwani aligned ideologically?
He was sympathetic to them, yeah. And he had like very strong links with them, obviously. And at that time, he was very hostile to the Taliban. And it wasn't until 1998, when the United States attacked them, that he changed his tune. And then especially after 2001, he played a big role in sort of rallying, mostly rhetorical support. I don't think he actually organized anything. But that's why he's often considered to be like, the brains behind them. But actually, at the start, it was the exact opposite. And even like you're saying with Osama bin Laden, for example, Osama bin Laden being a Salafi jihadi of sorts, he himself was not very ideological until the 1990s. Like before that, he was just like a normal sort of Muslim fighter in Afghanistan in the ideological sense. He was radicalized by Ayman Zawahiri, in the sense that
The current leader.
are Kafirs or whatever. And most of the Afghan groups, including the Taliban, but also including their opponents, they welcomed Osama bin Laden because they remembered the links from the 1980s, and also the fact that he had money. Obviously, that also plays a role.
Yeah.
But that obviously helps. But obviously, when he went to Afghanistan, like Sangar mentioned, he was welcomed by a group of commanders in Jalalabad, and I think only one of those commanders later joined the Taliban, but the rest of them either fought against the Taliban or they just went into exile. And at first, Osama bin Laden and his group were very suspicious of the Taliban as well because their links had not been with these groups. They had been more with the other groups that we're mentioning, the more internationalist sort of groups. And it wasn't until I think it was in 1997 when the Taliban were very kind of hard pressed in the Kabul area, summer 1997. That was when they started relying very heavily on foreign fighters, both Arabs but also like Pakistanis, and a lot of them were also like Deobandi types. It wasn't.
Yeah.
This is very interesting because it hits home for me. So, is this, you mentioned the Kabul area, is this in and around Shamali?
Exactly there, yeah, that's it.
Okay, sure. So essentially, what I know is that, my paternal side is from Shamali, ancestral villages there, and I'm not too aware of the military timeline of it, but I know there was a bit of a back and forth between Ahmad Shah Massoud's forces and the Taliban, but I've heard, like my auntie and others have told me that, when because the Taliban came a couple of times, but she said that a lot of them didn't actually speak Pashto or Farsi. They weren't able to respond, and there was there was a scorched earth campaign as well, because the villages was seen as being sympathetic towards Ahmad Shah Massoud, whereas they were sort of just caught in a crossfire. That's and this area Shamali, for the viewers that don't know it, it's a fertile plain north of Kabul that has a lot of fields and orchards, and a lot of fruit is grown there. So it's said that Ahmad Shah Massoud's forces would really use the cover of vegetation and trees and whatever to sort of wage a guerrilla sort of war. But unfortunately, I think I've heard also that one of my father's cousins was actually shot dead by the Taliban. They sort of asked him where he was from, and he said Karabakh, which is the small district north of Kabul, and he was shot dead after that. So there was a lot of brutality at that time.
Yeah, and the thing is that the Taliban were ambushed in this area by Massoud, I think, maybe 3 times, and they were like very devastating sort of ambushes as well. So in 1999, they adopted a scorched earth policy, which was basically burning farmland and stuff like that. Kind of evacuating people from villages and then burning down buildings and stuff. Actually, Fazl Muhammad Mazloum Yar, who is now in Qatar, I believe, he's on the negotiating team. He was in Guantanamo before that. Yeah. And at that time, he was the Taliban army commander.
Sure. So where was he
in charge of that?
What is his background?
He is from your tribe, and he is from southern Afghanistan. He was in. He was captured by the Americans, or he was captured by those.
He surrendered to Dostum, in Mazar Sharif.
In 2001, and then he was turned over to the Americans. And then he was in 2014.
Yeah, it's because I've actually visited Karabakh, because I'm sort of from 2 different parts of Afghanistan, but I visited, and in Karabakh there's like one tree in the middle of our village that was sort of half cut down by the Taliban, and it said that the Taliban didn't actually, for whatever reason, didn't manage to get to cut this last tree down, but it's there and it's still standing strong. So A lot of brutality, sadly. For a lot of us, it hits home. Sangar, do you have any stories?
Yeah, what I wanted to mention is that what happened actually during the 90s is that the first wave of Taliban, they were primarily the local Taliban from Afghanistan, from the madrasas or for Hujarat, and followers of figures like Mullah Muhammad Umar, and obviously the other leaders from Tahrik Nabi Muhammadi and Yunus Khalis, who all merged into one group. However, these battles in the 1995 and 1996 against first Hizb Islami, then against Jamiat, resulted to a very high number of casualties, which were then replenished with these students from madrasas in Pakistan. So when the Taliban came to Kabul, most of them were guys who are either born in Pakistan and raised in Pakistan, or people who are...
The Kabul area was famous for that,
Yeah. So people in Kabul, their idea of who the Taliban are is based on their experience of that particular era. So once the first wave of Taliban died on the front line, the second wave was mixed with a lot of guys who are born and raised in Pakistan, even though they were children of Afghan refugees or they were ethnic people from the Pakhtunkhwa or from Punjab. So what happened is when they came to Kabul, my uncles in Kabul, one of them, he was, I think I told this story before, but my uncle, he was a student at the medical faculty in Kabul University, and one of my father's aunts was really ill. She was from the village, and so my uncle took her with a taxi cab and another relative, and they were driving towards Kabul, towards the city, from the village towards the city, so that they can take her to a hospital. But during their trip, there was a checkpost by the Taliban. They stopped them, and everybody was forced to get out of the car. And my uncle, he was young, and I don't know what exactly made him look different, but they said, you're a communist because your hair looks different. So they got him out of the car and they beat him up, and he was really hurt while he was saying, look, this woman, she's my aunt, she's ill, she needs to go to the hospital, we need to go. But they wouldn't listen, so they beat him up. And my uncle and few other relatives, they would always say, these Taliban, most of them, they were Pakistanis. They spoke Punjabi or they spoke Hindi or Urdu, and they were obviously not native to Afghanistan. So this is their impression of their first exposure in Kabul with the Taliban. But now that we are 25 years ahead, if we talk back about that particular era, obviously the movement, the group,
back bad
yes,
memories for many people.
Yeah, and a lot of ideas of Afghans are shaped by their own experiences, like what they have experienced or that in that particular era shapes their views and opinions about what's going on right now. So that's why I think it's important that we have to understand that movements and groups evolve ideologically, and even that the whole consistency of the group, what kind of people are part of the Taliban, it changes. And now that we are in this current stage, that they have signed an agreement with the United States and they are involved in trying to kickstart an intra-Afghan peace negotiations, it's important to see, okay, what has changed since then? Who are the Taliban today? What kind of group?
Yeah, and I would also mention, like you said, between I guess 1997 and 2000, in the Kabul region specifically, there were a lot of foreigners, and a lot of these were, like you said, like students from Pakistan. At that time in Pakistan, there was also a lot of sort of sectarian violence between Shias and Sunnis, or between this
Yes.
Sunni group, etc. So a lot of these people were also like wanted, and they were basically recruited, they flew under the radar, and they went to the Taliban army, so to speak, and they were mainly in this Kabul region.
Yeah.
Because this was kind of like the rear, not the rear, but basically in that time there were two main Taliban armies. One was in the north, which was like around Mazar-e-Sharif and Kunduz, and then the other one was in front of Kabul. And the one in front of Kabul, because that was the region where Ahmad Shah Massoud had he was stronger in that region. That area, it was a very vulnerable area. So they filled in a lot of foreign fighters, and they were very indisciplined, and they were not really subject to any sort of oversight. And it was actually this actually became an opportunity for Osama bin Laden, because Osama bin Laden, he offered to organize like a brigade that he would pay for, and this would enable the Taliban to get some sort of control over these fighters and see who is coming in, who is coming out. So paradoxically, that helped Al-Qaeda get stronger, because Al-Qaeda was sort of supposed to kind of control these fighters or help organize these fighters. And I think in 1999 to 2000, this was when the Taliban started organizing this brigade. And from that point, they had like some rules, like you have to report to so-and-so commander or so-and-so minister, etc., before you register. But before that, in the 97 to 99 period, there was very little control over them, and a lot of the grievances or whatever that are held against the Taliban, like a very large number of them are from this period too. So this gave Al-Qaeda an opportunity to get closer to the Taliban, but on the other hand, I think it also gave the Taliban an incentive to not kick Al-Qaeda out, because they thought if we kick these guys out, who is going to who's going to fill the role that they were filling. And the interesting thing is actually Jalaluddin Haqqani, who was one of the old jihadi commanders. He wasn't from the Ikhwani commanders himself, but he was close to a lot of them, and he was also he had a very strong...
Did he fight under Maulawi Yunus Khalis?
Yes.
And he was very prominent in the southeast. In fact, I think after Massoud, he's probably the most famous commander. Massoud and maybe Ismail, he's probably the most famous from those jihadi commanders. He was one of the ones who joined the Taliban in the mid-90s, and he used to be at that front, at the Shamali front.
How did that happen? Sorry because Jalaluddin Haqqani comes from quite a different part. Not entirely different, but the Taliban thus far are sort of products of southern Afghanistan, what we say Loy Kandahar, areas like Uruzgan, Kandahar, Helmand, Zabul, whereas in Paktia their presence as of then was not that strong. How did they come? As well as, obviously there are other commanders that they co-opted from the other groups, but Jalaluddin Haqqani, by any measure, is quite a big catch. How did that happen?
So, basically in this southeast region, which was it's very mountainous, it's very strong, sort of tribal.
Loya Paktia, as we
say. Exactly. Yeah, and so in this region, that's where Jalaluddin Haqqani and a few others. There was Arsala Rahmani Daulat, who briefly became prime minister, and there were a couple of others. But there was Nasrullah Mansour, who formed his own group, and he was often considered to be. Some people consider him to be his ideas were taken by the Taliban later in the south. But these groups, they were sort of autonomous. Jalaluddin Haqqani in particular, he had very strong international connections, so he was, like I said, well known. And he is now considered to be very, very close to Pakistan, which is generally true. But in the early 1990s, actually, he was organizing efforts to kind of bypass Pakistan so that the commanders could do their own thing, could organize separately. And then when the war between Hikmatyar and Masood started, he initially tried to mediate between them, and then that didn't work. So he just went back to Loya Paktiya, and he just stayed there. And he had a lot of international business links. So I believe he helped organize part of like with the support of Pakistan, some of the militancy in Kashmir. He helped the Sudani government fight in southern Sudan at that time. So he had a lot of, and he was actually even he was close to the Gulf monarchs. So in fact, Sheikh Zayed, who was a founder of the UAE.
There's a university of his in Khost.
Yeah, Sheikh Zayed University.
He gave him a state reception at that time, because at that time the UAE weren't as anti, political Islam or whatever as they are now. But he actually gave him a state reception. So he had a lot of these sorts of links as well. So he was a big catch for the Taliban. And basically what happened was that the Taliban, they went to this region and the southeast of Afghanistan. I mentioned Nasrullah Mansour, his group, he himself had been killed earlier, but his brother Abdul Latif Mansour, who is still he's still with the Taliban, he's a pretty major leader. This group, they all went and they joined the Taliban. They had a lot of links and commonalities. Jalaluddin Haqqani, actually at first he wasn't going to join them, but Yunus Khalis, who is his party leader, he persuaded him that that this is going to be to avoid conflict or whatever. And in return for him joining the Taliban, they gave that area sort of like an autonomous sort of status. It was more or less self-governed. Like there was a southern governor and stuff, but they didn't really have much power. So anyway, so Jalaluddin Haqqani was actually at this Shamali front, but I'm not sure why, but he got taken away. He got taken out of there in 1997. But he was a big link for a lot of foreign fighters, especially Arabs, who were coming into Afghanistan. And his relations with the southern Taliban, for a brief time, they were also kind of tense, because he opposed some of their rules, for example.
Like which rules in particular do we know?
So they had a ban on certain education, on women's education, because their stance was that if the girls and boys can't be separated, until then, you're just gonna have to lump it, basically. That's what it amounted to. Even though they weren't
I like how you put that.
they weren't ideologically anti-women's education. Their stance was that it should be separate.
It's funny,
but in practice, it amounted to that.
It's funny you mentioned women's education right now, because there was a recent controversy. There is an article published in Foreign Policy about girls' school in Khost, where some of the girls who attend these schools are related to the Taliban fighters in Khost. Yeah, and as a response to this conversation, a few Western journalists and authors about Afghanistan engaged in this conversation online. So you know Kate Clark? Yeah, Kate Clark and Bette Dam, the author of the book about Mullah Omar, they were both exchanging information in response to this article. Yes, even during the time of Taliban, there were girls' education in Afghanistan.
There were. It wasn't enough, obviously, but it was still there.
Yes,
so,
and
sorry.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that for 19 years we've been fed with the same line. Taliban are against women's education. They don't want women to receive any education. And now after 19 years, now you see that, the reality is a lot more nuanced. It's not like what we've been told for the last 19 years. So, yeah, you were saying something.
Yeah, the specifically with the women's education, I can understand why people would have that impression, because in most of Afghanistan that education wasn't available. But at the same time, you have to remember the circumstances. It was a war. They were completely isolated internationally. They didn't have a lot of money. You could have said that they could have allowed mixed schools or whatever. But firstly,
that's not really going to happen, is it?
Yeah, firstly, there's a conservative sort of element, and then the other thing is that if you're basically raised in a war where there was considerable rape, especially when the Soviets were there,
yeah,
it makes people more defensive and more ultra conservative or whatever. So this is not even limited to the Taliban. A few of the people who were fighting against them were also very conservative. And actually, I remember reading Gilles Don Soro's book on Afghanistan, and he actually mentioned this. He mentioned that there was sort of a propaganda in the late 90s to make it seem that the Taliban were against women's education, and their opponents were, by extension, they were fighting for women's education. There was and the Taliban ideologically are not against women's education.
Yeah.
They have parameters or whatever, but that's kind of part of the culture or whatever, or this.